We'll just read from the Chumash. Okay, so Mike, you can sit out. Maybe even move the thing, the stender, so that it's not blocking it. So, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So a plane was, an El Al plane specifically, was getting ready to land at Ben Gurion Airport on the morning of December 25th. So the pilot or the purser gets on the public address system and says, we're beginning our descent into Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened and your tray tables in the upright and locked position. And then as soon as they land, the pilot gets on and says, we've landed at Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. To those of you who are in your seats with your seatbelts on and your tray tables in the upright and locked position, Merry Christmas. To those of you who are standing and getting your luggage down from the overhead compartments, welcome home. You know, and this obviously is a joke, but there's a certain reality, okay? And for example, Kelly has been to Israel twice. Okay, the first time she went on a tour, right? They traveled in tour buses. They traveled in tour buses and they ate, you know, prearranged meals in, you know, as a group in a restaurant, and it's not the same experience, right? And the second time she went with me, and I don't do those things, right? I rent a car or we travel by bus, and we eat in restaurants like, you know, normal people, right? So the first time we were waiting for a bus, right? And I don't know how many of you besides me have taken a bus, by which I don't mean a tour bus. I mean an Egged or a Dot bus, right? And this is the way you get on a bus in Israel. The bus comes and everybody rushes for the door and you go, and the old ladies go flying and you get on the bus, right? And the first time I did that, and Kelly looked at me and said, Charles? And I said, look, you can Charles me all you want, but if I don't do that, we're going to be standing at the bus stop all day, right? And then another time we went into a restaurant and the restaurant was fairly full and we stood there waiting for a table and a party of two got up and they left and I sat down, right? I did not wait for the bus person to clear the table. I did not wait for the hostess to seat us. I just sat down. And again, Charles, and I said, Kelly, this is Israel, okay? We can behave according to American norms and we will stand here all day, or we can behave according to Israeli norms and we'll have a nice meal, right? In other words, and eventually she got it, right? Eventually she got it, right? When in Yerushalayim, do as the Yerushalmi, right? I mean, that's a little bit of an adjustment of an old saying, but that's really the reality, right? That we are, you know, and the irony is that in this parsha, we're taught that we're supposed to be exemplary people, and everybody will look at us and say, oh, that's the way to be, right? So in Deuteronomy chapter 4, it says, see, I have imparted to you laws and rules as the Lord my God has commanded me for you to abide by in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. Observe them faithfully, for that will be proof of your wisdom and discernment to other peoples, who on hearing of all these laws will say, surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people. For what great nation is there that has a God so close at hand as is the Lord our God whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation has laws and rules as perfect as all this teaching that I set before you on this day? Right? So among the purposes of the Torah is for others to look at us and say that we are a wise and discerning people with wonderful laws given by God. Right? In other words, part of our task as Jews is to sanctify God through our behavior in the eyes of non-Jews. Now, there was an article in the New York Times some years ago by a fellow by the name of Noah Feldman. I don't know if that is a name that is familiar to anybody besides me, but Noah Feldman is a professor at Harvard Law School, a specialist in international law, and basically, I mean, this is a great irony that the Constitution of Iraq was written by an American Jewish law professor. But Noah Feldman was the person who wrote the current Constitution of Iraq. And Noah Feldman grew up in Boston, modern Orthodox, went to the Maimonides School. The Maimonides School is the day school in Boston, or probably in Brookline, that was founded by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, and it is really, and still kind of exemplifies that ideal of like first grade. It's one of the few Orthodox schools that is co-ed through the end of high school. Okay, this is already somewhat rare. But you know, the finest in Torah education and the finest in general studies, right? And so, but Noah Feldman was no longer Orthodox. In fact, this sort of the thing that kicked off this article was that he married a non-Jewish Asian American woman, and he says, and it's still not clear, and I don't care, that when they took the photo of his class reunion, they airbrushed them out of the photo. And no, that's not what happened. It's just, you know, we couldn't show the whole photo. It got cut off. We didn't intentionally airbrush them. I really don't know. But, you know, he was trying to make a larger point, right? And so he told this story about a local physician, a well-known figure in the community, well-respected, who addressed an assembly in the school on the topic of challenges that a modern Orthodox professional might face. Okay, now, instead of reading the whole thing, let me throw up this question, right? I mean, we all know the dictum, Pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat, right? Saving a life overrides Shabbat, right? If somebody's at your house, right? And I mean, I get this question really more out of idle curiosity than, you know, tachlis really looking for a halakhic ruling, right? But somebody is in my house on Shabbos and they get sick, can I pick up the phone, let's say, to call 911, right? Or they're really, really sick and it's not too sick to even wait for 911. Can I take them in the car and drive them to the ER, right? And I usually give a trick answer and I say, no, you're not allowed to call 911. You're required to call 911, right? You're not allowed to drive them to the hospital. You're required to drive them to the hospital, right? But what's the halachic basis, right? I mean, you should simply say, well, it's self-evident, right? But very few things in halacha are self-evident, right? So what's the halachic basis? I mean, what, you know, you could just as easily, like there are certain religions, right? There are certain religions that don't believe in medical care at all, right? If God makes you sick, God wants you to be sick. And you can pray. I mean, if God wants you to get better, you'll get better. But who are we to interfere with what God wants? That's obviously not a Jewish perspective, right? But what is the halachic basis for violation, or not even really violation, it's not a violation, but overriding Shabbat to save somebody's life? The statement in the Gemara is Halel alav Shabbat achat kadesha yishmor Shabbatot harbe. Right? Violate on his behalf one Shabbat so that he may observe many Shabbatot. Right? And that's, in other words, it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? If the guy dies, can't observe Shabbos anymore, right? So you violate one Shabbos, and then the person will live and violate many Shabbatot, right? Where's the problem with that, right? The problem with that is that really applies only to Jews, right? So then one would think that in terms of, you know, black letter law, you're only allowed to override Shabbat to save the life of a Jew. Now, bottom line, black letter law, not so. Okay? You are also allowed, indeed required, to override Shabbat to save the life of a non-Jew. Okay, the question is, what's the reasoning? How do you get there? Barnaby.
It's because if you don't, then other people will look upon Jews badly. And so, for reasons of what you feel Hashem, will instituted that you save life of non-Jew anyway, for appearance's sake.
Right, essentially for appearance's sake, right? Mipnei darkei shalom, right? Because of the ways of peace. In other words, if it were to become known that Jews will let you die rather than override Shabbat to save your life, this would cause anti-Semitism, which is something we don't want to do, right? And therefore, that's why we do it, but it's not because of the intrinsic value of non-Jewish life. It's really to inoculate against anti-Semitism. Right now, frankly, there are two ways of looking at this, right? One is to say that's really disgusting, right? And the other is to say that's really brilliant. Okay, now why would I say that's really brilliant? Right, because you have a result that you want to achieve, right? That, let's say, Kule alma la plige, right? Nobody disagrees that this is a good result, right? So you found a way to get to the desired result despite the lack of a text to hang it on, right? So this is a good thing. Right now, I happen to think that actually both of these statements, yeah, Mike.
I'm just curious that all of those sentences that say, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and be kind to the orphan and the widow and the this and the that, would that not give you a halakhic basis to take somebody to the hospital?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would, okay, but what you're dealing, look, I mean, you can construct pretty much, I'm gonna almost say any answer to any question by cherry picking verses, right? I mean, there are exactly those verses that say, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, right? Treat the widow and the orphan and the stranger fairly, so on and so forth, right? There are also verses that say, when you enter the land, kill everyone, right? And, you know, I mean, so, you know, and even in this Parsha, you know, warning us from fraternizing with non-Jews. Right now, of course, you can avoid fraternization without like actively desiring people's death too, but right, but you can, but the fact of the matter is that, look, you can construct a universalistic ethic out of the Torah, right? I mean, from the very beginning, right? Every person is created in the image of God. Right? It doesn't say only Jews are created in the image of God. There were no Jews, right? Or you can create an ethic that basically is very ethnocentric, Judeo-centric, right? And I would say that the answer, and that gets me back really to the stories that I told at the beginning, you know, about waiting for a bus or getting seated at a restaurant in Israel, is what I would call an ethic of mutuality, right? In other words, you know, there's a phrase that I once read in an article, in a political article about the United States, that used the term kamikaze constitutionalism, right? In other words, right, we have to do certain things and we can't look at what the results are, right? So if, you know, if people want to march through the streets of town with torches, you know, shouting anti-Jewish slogans, the Constitution requires us to allow them to do that, right? Or, you know, we can't, right? And the question is there an ethic of mutuality, right? And in a society, if you're in London queuing for a bus and you behave like you're in Jerusalem, that's clearly wrong, right? If you are in London and the norm is to queue politely for a bus, then that's what you do, right? But if you are in Jerusalem and you seek to behave like a Londoner, you will never get on a bus, right? That's just not the way it works, right? And if you live in a society where everybody hates Jews, right? I mean, I'll give you a real life example, okay? my paternal grandfather was one of 6 siblings, rather. Okay, and the family story, and I have no way of knowing whether this is true or not, okay, but the family story is that one of the brothers got sick in Russia when he was a kid, and it was Holy Week, okay, and the only doctor in their town was a Christian, and he had taken a sort of special vow of piety not to treat Jews during Holy Week. And so he died. My great uncle died. Okay, again, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's not implausible, right? And in a society where Christian doctors would let Jews die rather than to treat them, maybe it's not so terrible to say that we won't treat, right? But that's not American society, right? It's not, I'm sure that there are anti-Semitic doctors, just like there are Jewish doctors who hate Gentiles, but it's not the norm, and it's not an assumption that you would make, right? So we live in a society where there is essentially an ethic of mutuality, right? And this goes way back to the 13th century. Okay, a guy named Menachem HaMeiri, who lived in Provence in the 13th century, and he was a halachic authority, and he essentially created this halachic category of umot hagdurot b'darkei hadat, right? Nations bound by the ways of religion. Okay, so if you look at the stuff in the Bible, stuff in the Torah that basically says, kill everybody, right? Or don't trade with them, don't have social business relationships with them, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's an actual statement in this week's Parsha called Lo Techonem, okay, that you shall not, it's not exactly clear what the Hebrew there means. It could be chen, meaning grace, or it could be hanaya, meaning like a possession of a piece of land, right? But there are today, unfortunately, in Israel, halachic authorities that say that on the basis of this verse, it's illegal to sell land in the land of Israel to non-Jews. All right, it's one of the reasons why, the right-wing settlers go nuts at the possibility of any sort of withdrawal from territories, because according to them, the Torah forbids giving or selling land in the land of Israel to non-Jews, right? But, the Meiri would say, that did apply in the biblical era to pagans, because there was not that ethic of mutuality, right? And that, to treat pagans fairly is like being a Londoner waiting for a bus in Jerusalem, right? But that doesn't apply today to our neighbors who are Muslim or Christian, because even though they differ with us in ritual and even in theology, right, they are nations bound by the ways of religion. In other words, right, they essentially have the same moral code as we do, right? I mean, where it says thou shalt not steal, the Christian version of the Ten Commandments doesn't say thou shalt steal, right? Where it says thou shalt not murder, the Muslim version doesn't say thou shalt murder, right? They are bound, they have the same ethical guidance from their religion as we do, so that where there's a general adherence to a moral code, we're all on the same footing, and we're expected to act morally towards our fellow human beings, right? So if it were me, of course, I have never in my life been asked by an Orthodox doctor about treating a non-Jew on Shabbat, right? I mean, it's not the world in which I operate, right? If I were, I would say that on the basis of the Meiri, that there's no issue. That our neighbors have this ethic of mutuality, and I would expand it beyond simply Christians and Muslims, right? I don't know too much about Buddhism or Hinduism, but I don't notice Buddhists or Hindus acting generally less morally than Christians and Muslims in our society. I suspect, in fact, quite the opposite, right? But that ethic of mutuality, but that same ethic of mutuality, I mean, fortunately, you know, the flare-up last week between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad kind of was resolved pretty quickly, right? But this is part of the dilemma of fighting those kind of enemies, right? It's what's called asymmetrical warfare, right? There are rules of war, right? But those rules of war presupposes that the other side is following them too, right? I mean, on the one hand, you're not supposed to attack civilians, right? We all agree you're not supposed to attack civilians, right? But you're also not supposed to put rocket launchers in civilian areas, right? You're not supposed to bomb hospitals and religious buildings and schools, right? But you're also not supposed to use hospitals and religious buildings and schools for military purposes, right? I mean, if you put a rocket launcher on the roof of a hospital, right, and then the hospital gets bombed, whose fault is that, right? Whose fault is that, right? And that's the problem when there's not an ethic of mutuality. We are fortunate that for the most part, and look, I mean, we know that there are certain people in this society who call themselves Christians, right, who don't live by an ethic of mutuality, right? I mean, they may love Israel, but they have no particular use for Jews, right? And whenever they talk about George Soros or the Rothschilds or whatever, we know who they're talking about, right? And, you know, perhaps things that happened earlier this week may really put an end to that phenomenon once and for all. We can hope, right? I mean, the opposite could also happen too, right? But there is no sense in the Torah of Jews being superior, right? But there is this idea of an ethic of mutuality that, you know, hopefully when people live by that ethic, we can as well. Shabbat Shalom. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. If not, all right, so we'll shut this down for a second.